Welcome to my next video in the Steps Method concept series. Today we're going to analyze the position. Chess analysis is a crucial skill in chess. As you've heard in my video on the book review of Michael Adams, Think Like a Super GM, club players use a lot of intuition, but masters and grandmasters base their decisions in chess primarily on analysis. So the framework for analysis in the step method is first we do an orientation of direct threats and positional elements, then we calculate and evaluate and establish the goal, what we want to achieve, find moves that fit with the goal, using the mini concepts of the step method, so that can be attacking the king, gain access, bring attackers, eliminate defenders, find a mating pattern and execute the mate. Look for forcing moves as preparatory moves, increase activity of your pieces, exploit vulnerability of your opponent, and verify the calculation. So how will the position change after I play my move? And also, did I really consider the strongest reply of my opponent? And then, when it comes to orientation, for the direct threats, we had this left side looking at unprotected pieces, the king, pieces with limited mobility or that are vulnerable, pieces on one file, rank or diagonal, pinned pieces, pieces on a battery, and pieces with a crucial defending task that are tied up to defense and potential passed pawns. And after the orientation, we will go to the candidate moves and calculation and evaluation, and then we bring in the tactical themes and we look at the positional elements of improving activity and exploiting vulnerability. So in the end, just like in the last video on position analysis, I'd like to ask you to create an analysis tree. This is of the previous example. So let's go to chess, and then we will go back to the analysis tree at the end of the video. So this is the position on hand. And so take a moment to think about the orientation first. So material is equal, it's a symmetrical pawn structure. Only the bishop on g4 is on the half of the opponent. Black has a direct threat. Bishop takes f3, damaging the pawn structure in front of the king, and potentially followed up by knight takes d4. Black has an unprotected pawn on f7. There's also an unprotected pawn on g7. But when you do your orientation, I think it's important to look at the relevance of the characteristics. And so the pawn on g7 is less relevant than the pawn on f7. White controls the e-file, has a rook on e1. And it looks like that those are the most important things, and we have to really think about how we're going to cope with the direct threats of bishop takes f3, followed by knight takes d4. So I think the most important thing that we saw is this threat. So let's go to defending. What can we do? Well, we can, of course, play a move like bishop e2. So we're going now to candidate moves and then to variations and the evaluation at the end. So bishop e2 would be a possibility, but after a rook h2 e8, it feels like a very balanced position where we don't have a lot of initiative anymore. We gave up the control over the e-file, so nothing spectacular. So when we go back to the starting position, I think what is much more interesting, of course, is to think about, can we have an active defense? Can we have some kind of counterattack or move away with the knight? And of course, there are two moves that stand out. Knight e5 and knight b5. So when you make your tree, I think you have to consider bishop e2, you have to consider a move like knight e5 and a move like knight b5, and think if there's any difference or whether they in the end transpose. Knight e5, of course, is interesting. What is knight e5 threatening? It's threatening the undefended pawn on f7. And there's also another threat. Can you find it? So we have knight takes f7 is a threat. The other threat is knight takes g4 followed by bishop f5 with a double attack on the knight on g4 and the king on c8. And I think if you start out, right, we were not really focusing on this c8 g4 diagonal, but somehow now that we are just considering our first moves, we can see that actually there is some relevance to it. So knight e5 has a double threat. It's like a double attack. And now the question, of course, is like, how are we going to defend against knight e5 as from the black side? So take a moment to consider how you would go about defending against knight e5. I think there are two moves that stand out. Of course, we can play bishop h5 or we can play bishop e6. Note that, for instance, after a move like rook f8 or queen f8, we have our threat of knight takes g4 followed by bishop f5. So bishop h5 looks a little bit more active, right? Because we're not playing our bishop back, but then we can bring another attacker. And now we start to feel the heat. And we can see, for instance, after the queen who's under attack moves, we can take on c6, b takes c6, knight takes a7. And we see also the relevance of this weakness of this diagonal c8 to h3. If black would play a king d7, bishop d5, king d6, queen b4 would be checkmate. And after king b7 we would have queen a5. So we can see that bishop h5 looks more interesting because we keep the bishop looking at enemy squares, but actually the weakness that we didn't identify when we were doing the orientation of this diagonal c8 h3 is so critical that it looks better to play the bishop back and play bishop e6. So how would you continue here? Probably still with knight b5, right? We would just bring another attacker. And now we see a second element, right? So when we were doing our orientation, we did not have any idea that the queen would be kind of vulnerable and the black king would be vulnerable. But suddenly, by these two moves, white has activated their forces and is having a strong attack on the black king. So where can the queen go? Can you refute queen b4? Easy, right? Queen b4. We play knight takes a7, king b8, knight takes c6, and then the queen on b4 is no longer undefended. So you should be able to visualize that. So where do you think the queen will go? Well, it can go to e7 or f8. Let's assume to e7. And now I would like you to consider what happens after knight takes c6 and b takes c6. How would you continue in that position? Would you play knight takes a7 or would you play something else? And a lot of players, of course, they would be tempted to play knight takes a7, thinking that black will respond with king b7. and after king b7 bring the queen to a5. So I'm deliberately not showing the moves because I would like you to practice to visualize this. I'm already showing quite some moves already on the board. So queen e7, knight takes c6, b takes c6, knight takes a7, king b7, queen a5 with the threat of queen a6 check, protected by the bishop on d3 and followed up by knight takes c6 with mate to follow. And that is of course a very strong move. But now let's go back to the third step in our analysis process, which is, did we really consider the strongest move by black after knight takes a7? And of course there's another move that black can play, not attacking the knight but playing king d7. Can you visualize that position? And now you have to ask yourself, am I having a decisive attack there, or am I concerned that my knight on a7 will be trapped? So let me show you. Right, knight takes a7. Right, we said after the move king b7, white has an easy win with queen a5. But we have to verify our calculation, consider the best move by our opponent, and after king d7, the question is, how are we going to continue our attack and get our knight back into the game? Because after queen c3, queen d6, c6 is defended, and black can start working on the attack of the knight with rook b8, rook b7, or rook a8 immediately. So not so clear. So when we go back to the position we had on hand, knight b5, and we visualize the queen going to e7, we take on c6. Do we have another plan there? And what has happened with the pawn structure of black? The pawn structure of black has been damaged, and we have a beautiful outpost, potentially, for the knight. So if the knight could dream, and it says currently I'm on b5, I cannot go to a7 because I might be trapped, the knight might say, I'd like to be on c5. And then we come to the conclusion that white has a very strong idea, but it's a kind of a switch in plan, that you're not going for the material advantage by taking on a7 and then potentially lose the knight in the process, but you're going to play on the outpost on c5 that has been created by the weakening of the pawn structure. So after b takes c6, we play knight c3, and the idea of knight c3 is to play knight a4, knight c5, and then there are of course the possibilities to bring the queen to a5, the bishop to a6, and the rook to e3. And the rook can go from rook e3 to b3. And when we have to evaluate this position, we say probably that white is much better here. And you can see that actually after knight c3, if black would just try to defend it, c5 has been defended, but the attack on the black king, right, the pawn structure has been damaged, is still there. So the idea of bishop a6 and queen a5 and rook e3 are still very powerful. So it's important to verify your calculation and to see the move king d7 and not to rely solely on king b7, and to be able to switch plans and going for this, from this all-out kingside attack to playing on the weakened square c5 because of the change in pawn structure. This is from step 4+, which is for players rated between 1500 and 1800. So there was one move that we did not consider yet, so let's go back to the beginning. We were focusing on knight e5. So does it matter if we change the move order and we go to knight b5 immediately? And so after knight b5, right, the queen will probably go to d7, because it cannot go to e7 because of the rook on e1. And if the queen would go all the way to f8, it is far away from the defense of the king. So white can follow up with a move like queen f4 and threaten mate in 1 on c7. So it looks that the queen would have to go probably after knight b5 to d7. But of course, after knight d7, we can play again the move knight e5. And now we see it's just a minor difference. And after knight e5, d takes e5. Where do we think the knight will go? Well, right, it is almost trapped if it goes to h5. So it looks active to go to e4. And now look at the black position and evaluate what the vulnerabilities are. Right? So the queen on d2 is under attack. So that's of course something we have to do. White is attacking, so we don't want to trade pieces. We don't want to play bishop e4 here at this moment. That's not what we are trying to do. We want to continue our attack. In addition, what we see, of course, is that if we have saved our queen, we would like to play on the next move, f3, with a double attack on those two pieces. And there's of course the knight on b5, who's still looking to a7. So a very logical continuation in this position would be queen a5, with the threat of capturing on a7 and f3. So we can see that both variations are actually very good for white, knight e5 and knight b5. And I hope that you enjoyed this analysis. Again, what we saw also in this analysis is that active defense is very critical. So we didn't play bishop e2, but we activated one of our pieces and attacked the pawn on f7 or attacked the queen on d6. And we took over the initiative in the position. Initially, this position looked kind of balanced and relatively stale because both sides were still playing on their own half. But before we knew it, we had a strong initiative with white. And I also hope that you appreciate this change in plan, where we didn't continue our attack with knight takes a7, but we rerouted the knight back to c3 to play on the outpost on c5, and then starting the king's attack with queen a5, bishop d3 and rook e3. Thank you very much. And finally, this is the analysis tree that I promised. It's in my own handwriting. Analysis is messy. It's not like an engine who spits out a tree. It is our own thinking, and it's not completely linear. So I think that's okay, and it just highlights considerations that humans are making instead of looking for the perfect answer. It's about the process, and it's actually not so much about the solution. Thank you again.